Good afternoon, members. My name is Heather Edelson, Vice Chair. I call this meeting to order of the Public Safety and Criminal Justice Reform and Finance Policy Division. Today we have before us the Post Board presentation here, and please, if you can go ahead and state your name, and you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. My name is Nathan Gove. I'm the Executive Director of the Minnesota Peace Officer Standards and Training Board, known as the Post Board. And I promise to be brief. This is our budget overview. Just quickly, the mission of the Post Board is to advance Minnesota's law enforcement profession as the state's regulatory agency by adopting and regulating the education, licensing, standards, and training of Minnesota's officers, both pre-service and in-service. Some key services: we license and relicense the state's 12,000 licensed peace officers. We certify and monitor the education professional peace officer component at the state's, my slide says 29, but it's actually now 30 colleges and universities statewide that provide the pre-service education component for people entering law enforcement. We conduct 428 on-site compliance reviews of law enforcement agencies to ensure they're complying with state statutes and model policies, mandated training, et cetera. We also process complaints of peace officer misconduct, those that fall within the board's jurisdiction and those that do not as well. And we manage the state's training reimbursement, which is essentially state aid to local government for ongoing in-service peace officer training. And just this past year, we switched away from a bubble exam with number 2 pencils to online licensing, which is much more efficient for the people in our state and out that want to enter the profession. We also approved the ongoing in-service training courses for post-credit, and we manage, as of July 1st of 2016, we got back in the business of tracking the continuing education of licensed peace officers. We also maintain pre-service education learning objectives. We have a staff of 10. That's down from 15 back in 2001. Our positions, including myself, an assistant executive director. We have our testing and licensing, our education coordinators, our standards coordinators, office and administrative staff. The board is funded on a surcharge on traffic and criminal surcharges. We operate off of the original $25 of this surcharge, which has grown to at least $75. This funds the board's not only our operating budget, but the training reimbursement fund of about $2.8 million. In statute 357, it lays out sort of how that surcharge is broken down: 1% to DNR and 39% to the Post Board, with 60% of the surcharge returning to the general fund. So since I took over in 2014, we've been tracking what this slide shows is in the red, what would be the 39% of the surcharge. And the blue line, which has remained quite consistent since the early 2000s, is our budget. And we have seen a decline in the surcharge. The board, until recently, 2018, midway through fiscal year 2018, never actually received the full 39%. Our budget was appropriated much less. And so those additional funds in red, when they were above the line, also returned to the general fund. This has created a few challenges, reference the surcharge for us, as if you look at this slide, the descending red bars indicate what would be a growing deficiency in the special revenue account as it pertains to the Post Board funding, if the percentage was not changed. The green is what the fund is bringing in currently projected. The blue is our budget, and we've even included, if it increased based on the government's recommendation, obviously it grows that deficiency a little bit. So currently, of the current fiscal year, we do have a funding deficiency request in. It's not due to Post overspending its budget. There's a deficiency in the account that we estimate at about $500,000 on the worst case scenario. Surcharges don't come in equally each month, and there's a lag in the reporting. We are supportive of certainly the governor's recommendation that this deficiency be made up with a one-time appropriation from the general fund. It does not increase our budget. It just meets what's currently appropriated in law. Looking forward for fiscal year 20, this is our entire budget, and it's significant in that back in 2018, the legislature appropriated an additional $6 million per year for 4 years as part of the police training bill to help supplement law enforcement agencies across the state to provide the mandated training, which is ongoing. That law took effect July 1st of 2018, but you see our $4.1 million operating budget. There's also $90,000 estimated from a $20 reinstatement on a driver's license that are suspended for failure to appear or pay fines. And the governor has also recommended, based on our request for a rulemaking position to restore a position back to the Post Board, we are authorized to promulgate rules. And we've done really little rulemaking since 2010 when we last had that internal position. We are currently doing some obsolete rulemaking and adding 3 misdemeanor convictions to our standards of conduct. But that's being done by a staff person and myself. We have little experience in it. We're sort of flying blind and doing the best we can. So on this particular, when I talked about the percentage of the surcharge that funds the Post Board, and really was one of the reasons the special revenue account was established many, many years ago. The board, in working with MMB and our budget officer, in projections, we've made a request, which the governor has recommended, to increase the percentage of the original $25 surcharge to 62%, from which the legislature can appropriate our budget. It allows us to continue within the dedicated funding source used since the creation of the criminal and traffic surcharge. It also is calculated to allow for potential modest appropriations and further fluctuations in the revenues. Without an increase, you see, we look at, if I bring it back to the slide of the red over in fiscal year 23, it grows to about $1.2, $1.3 million, which would be our entire operating budget. So this particular slide shows obviously the projected deficit for the current fiscal year, and if the 62% was enacted, in yellow, the what would be sort of the overage of what the expected appropriations would be. We figured in blue what the budget increase recommended by the governor would look like, and in green, those bars indicate what at 62% would be available for post funding. So we certainly believe that it solves that problem. It brings it out well past 2023. It's something that the board certainly supports. And so as part of our budget request is to restore the rulemaking position. The board, we need to promulgate rules. We need to be in a position with the expertise and the internal capacity to respond to legislative initiatives, directions. We received a letter from former Governor Dayton ordering us to start rulemaking. Well, it's not that easy when we don't have somebody on staff with the expertise to begin that complicated process. So while we're working on it now for a first phase of rulemaking. The board certainly needs to continue with that, as I suspect there will be other calls for us to amend our rules depending on statutory changes. So just to review, we do have a current fiscal year deficiency request. A recommendation to restore an F1 FTE at post for rulemaking with some additional costs over the biennium on what we feel would be associated with rulemaking, and to change the percentage of the surcharge available for post appropriation to 62%. So I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gove. Representative Johnson.
Chair, one thing I'm wondering is if testifier could explain how much administrative rulemaking the post board actually does.
Mr. Gove.
Madam Chair, Representative Johnson, over the years, quite a lot. We have, but it has really slowed significantly due to not having a rulemaking position on staff. There's only been 2 instances since 2010. Both were, one was good cause exemption, very streamlined by the legislature pertaining to part-time licensed peace officers. And the other is a current initiative we're in the middle of, just released our initial notice to licensees today for updating rules, some of which are unnecessary and outdated. So.
Representative Johnson.
Chair, Mr. Rose. So it takes a full-time person to do 2 rulemaking things in how many years?
Mr. Gove.
Madam Chair, Representative Johnson, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly is.
Representative Johnson, do you want to re-ask the question?
Yeah, I'll rephrase that. You said that you've only had 2 instances where you've had rulemaking changes since 2011. I'm just wondering if you need if that's all their amount of rulemaking you're doing in that time period. Just wondering what you need a full-time person for that for.
Mr. Gove.
Yep, Madam Chair, Representative Johnson. There's actually plenty of rulemaking the board should be doing, but hasn't. We have, over the last year, engaged the Interagency Rules Committee and other entities looking to subcontract some of that work, and we have not been successful. Many agencies have limited rulemaking staff themselves, and when we've reached out to them, they're too busy to be able to put forth a person, even if we paid for that, to the post board. And it really just puts us in a difficult position because our rules in many ways have been quite untouched. It is an initiative of the board to comprehensively update those rules. And I just don't see any other way to do it without a on-staff person with the technical expertise.
Representative Johnson, you have a follow-up?
I just want to thank you for the explanation, and also on that increase in percentage of the fines. I do not recall how much was in the increase we did last year's budget that left the House floor, but I think we did try to take care of it then. So hopefully we can take care of it this year.
Thank you.
Members, do you have any other questions? Representative Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Director. I had to step out, so if questions have been asked and answered, just tell me and I'll move on. I have a couple questions about the continuing education that we have officers going through right now. How many hours does it equal out per year? And if you have an idea of what that increase may have been like in the past 5 or 10 years, just so we can get a sense of what we're asking our peace officers to do with continued training.
Mr. Gove.
Madam Chair, Representative Dean, so the amount of minimum continuing education credits that an officer must have in a 3-year license cycle has remained at 48.
Okay.
Over the years, the amount that are mandated, especially in light of the mandated police training bill, which incorporated 16 mandated hours within that 48, is now up to over half, depending on when an officer takes their pursuit driving and emergency vehicle operations. It could be up to 32 hours out of the 48 that is actually mandated by the state. A recent survey that we did this year of officers who are up for renewal at the end of June of this year, myself included, 72% have at least 60 CEs, which I think is quite significant. We've always thought that officers, we know that the sheriffs and police chiefs are sending their officers to a wide variety of training that their communities say are important for their officers, in addition to the mandates. So I think the thought that, yes, there are probably some very small agencies that meet it at 48 to 49, but the vast majority exceed it quite nicely.
Representative Dean.
If I could just sort of add a question on top of that question. So it figures out to be roughly 2 days per year for an officer. Have you been hearing from many departments that that's creating some issues or burdensome for those departments at this time?
Mr. Gove.
Since I've taken over, yes, I have heard of that. And I would also say, just my experience as an officer and an administrator, that while an agency of 5 officers, it might seem fairly easy to put 5 officers through training, staffing becomes an issue, shift coverage. But the flip side is, if you look at a St. Paul or a Minneapolis, to run somewhere between 600 and 800 officers through mandated training is quite a challenge in and of itself. And so there's always that balance that I certainly hear from our customers and constituents of the Post Board about making sure that officers aren't spending all their time in classrooms rather than out serving the public and handling calls, sort of the bread and butter of their mission.
Thank you, Director. And Madam Chair, a couple more questions. I'm not going to be long. So last week we were talking about the issues, or maybe it was the week before, around changing the issues around fines and suspended driver's license and things like that. And you mentioned a portion of the budget which comes from the reestablishment of suspended licenses. Have you guys begun to look at what that might mean if the number of suspended licenses drops drastically, and what that might mean to your budget?
Mr. Gove.
Madam Chair, Representative Dean, yes, we have. We are currently working on a fiscal note. As I indicated in the slide, our current estimates are $90,000 of the non-DWI reinstatement that we believe would be impacted potentially if the number of suspensions for failure to appear or pay fines went down. That particular account has continued to decrease significantly. When it was first enacted in about 2007, it generated almost $500,000. So while we rely on that, we also realize that that does not make up the main portion of our budget. I think increasing the percentage of the surcharge on convictions available to the Post Board, because that fund does generate significant amount of funds, could potentially help us in that area if there was a statutory change.
One more follow-up, Representative Dean.
I don't know if this is a question, Madam Chair, or a statement, but you had talked about reduction in staff, and there are sometimes we hear messaging around we need to reduce government. So if you're able to still do your job with less, thank you. That's reduced government, but if it's causing hardship, I think it's really important for you to begin to let us know about the need. And it sounds like with the governor's one-time money, that might begin to address that. But when I think of your ongoing budget, I think of what that need might be as well. And again, that was more of a statement. If you'd like to respond, that's fine. If not, I'm good, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Well,
Mr.
Madam
Gove.
Chair and Representative Dean, I appreciate that. I mean, I understand. I'm not advocating for 5 more staff to, find jobs for them to do, but they've been very specific based on interactions with our board. And frankly, the expectations the public has, the legislature has on the post board's role in the law enforcement profession. And that's what I'm trying to sort of have in place, as I don't see a reduction in potential changes that people may be asking the post board to perform. I just want to be able to do them to the very best I can with the staff I have.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Gove. I'm wondering if you can explain to me a little bit more your graph on post-dedicated surcharge funding history. Now, you've got one line which is post-appropriations from surcharge revenues and then actual dedicated revenues available for post-expenditures. So what was the extra money going to that you all didn't get there between 2002 and now?
Madam Chair, Representative Lesh, I don't know. It returns to the general fund for other appropriations.
And Madam Chair, Mr. Gove, 2002, was that the first year that you started? What was the first year you got dedicated funding?
Mr. Gove.
Madam Chair, Representative Lesh, I believe it was in the early 90s, if not late 80s. When it's been amended many times. I don't know if Mr. King from MMB is in the room, but he's been tracking it. But I want to say it's early 90s when it was first established.
Well, Madam Chair, if we could, I think we had an answer from staff on that in judiciary at some point. So it might be at your fingertips, I don't know. But I thought it was late 90s. I thought it was 97. And then when we hit those budget crunch years in 2003 through 2007, we jacked it up 2 or 3 more times, is what I recall from what the answer was in judiciary. But I don't know. Can staff speak to that?
Mr. Johnson, can you speak to that?
Madam Chair, Representative Lesh, and members, I don't have the exact dates right in front of me, but my memory is consistent with yours in that the criminal traffic surcharge was adopted in the late 90s. I believe it was 97. The initial amount of that was $25. I do not know what percentage, if any, of that was dedicated to the post board at that time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Madam Chair. That would have been my question. Mr. Gove, I got a bill up that would wipe out the surcharge because of the increased effects that has had on low-income folks, and we used it to fill gaps during the budget crunch years. I know that most folks who come in front of this legislature desire some form of dedicated funding, right? Because that's great, because then you have to fight less for it, although it's not working as well for you since you guys aren't getting what you should be. So in your case, it might be a little bit different. But most groups come up here and they say, give us dedicated funding so we don't have to fight for our budget every year. And a lot of times that works. I have a general aversion to putting spending like that on autopilot because I think that folks should come up and justify their budget to the legislature every year. I think that's the whole point of it. That said, my bill to wipe out the surcharge, I'd like to find a way to hold you harmless on this because you guys do need your funding. And so I'd like you to work with me and determine whether or not that increase proposed as you have, going from 39% to 62%, if there would be a way to tweak those numbers so that you get what you need and that we're able to make folks who are now bearing the brunt still after 15 years of those budget crunches. Those of you who weren't around, I'm looking around the table to see who was here back when we did all that nasty stuff, and there aren't too many members around the table who were, but it was ugly. It was absolutely ugly, and we found, as we say in the military, crap flows downhill. We don't actually say that. It's a lot more vulgar than that, but in those years, we left a lot of people holding the bag, and they're still holding the bag for that, and that, namely the surcharge on this, which is why I want to get rid of that. That said, I'd like to work with you, see if you have an idea of how we can at least find a way to hold you guys harmless to a certain extent. Now, if it's hold us harmless by making sure it's a dedicated source, I don't know what our solution is there, but that's my whole point in that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Gove, do you have any response to that?
I don't.
Okay.
I'd be happy to work with you, Representative Lesh.
Thank you.
Very well. Members, do you have any more questions for Mr. Gove? All right. Thank you, Mr. Gove, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Chair Considine, I'm going to actually ask you to come up here now because I have the next two bills. If you wouldn't mind taking over the gavel.
Oh, she can let you make her own motion. Okay. They look like they're getting settled in there. Chairman Lesh would just point out that I was on the city council in Mankato, and I do remember those lean years because we were one of the people, LGA and some of those things got cut during those time periods too. Representative Edelson, would you like to, I'm sorry, Chair Edelson, would you like to move to have your bill laid over for possible inclusion?
Chair, yes, I would.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Great. Chair and members, the Youth Intervention Program, also known as YIP, are community-based approaches that reverse the growth of state government by helping young people growing up with toxic stress, trauma, and abuse. The data demonstrates that with adult support, youth stabilize, plan for the future, stay out of trouble, and prepare for adulthood. The outcome is self-sufficient, contributing adults instead of the likely lifelong consumers of the public services. About half of youth served by YIP are in the 7-county metro area and are about half in greater Minnesota. In 2017, 59% of youth served were girls, 58% were between 13 and 17 years old, and 62% were youth of color. In 2017, 72 YIP grants were awarded to 70 different youth-serving organizations. The average grant was $40,621, yet 14,590 youth received intervention services. The average cost per youth was $200. The break-even summary handout shows that, and those should be in your packets, members, shows that only 2.5% of these youth have to become productive adults for YIP to pay for itself. Any more than that is money back in the state's pocket. Youth intervention programs, YIP, again, needs in Minnesota, and the need of it needs legislative support. Roughly $18 million per biennium was requested in 2015, the last time the Minnesota Office of Justice Programs issued a request for the proposal. The yearly YIP allocation is $6.5 million per biennium. The $11.5 million gap in youth intervention leads to chronic use of adult intervention programs at higher costs, literally billions of dollars each year. House Bill 665 reforms how we support youth to become productive adults. Requests an additional $11.5 million appropriation for YIP. 57,500 more youth will be served via this YIP funding. Members, this is a bipartisan piece of legislation with many of the authors from both parties because each and every one of us know, myself included, that these are effective programs that work. I am truly honored to present this bill before you today. I would now like to call my first testifier, Stacy Kohler.
Ms. Kohler,
Did
state
I
your
say
name
that
for the
right? I
record.
apologize, Stacy.
It's Collier.
Collier, French.
It's new. I just recently was married, so.
Oh, are you okay?
Yes.
Congratulations. Yeah, please give us the correct pronunciation for the record and go ahead with your testimony.
My name is Stacy Collier. I'm here today before you to tell you a little bit about my story. I am pretty much exactly what you named off on that list. I have come from a low-income family. I come from a split family. I come from a family of diverse backgrounds. And I also come from a family that has been stricken with a lot of the hardships and outcomes that are not very positive from those backgrounds. I have family members who are still battling addiction today. I grew up in that household. I was subjected and exposed to many forms of abuse that no child should ever be subjected to. I also have witnessed a lot of things that I'm pretty sure all of you who are parents, you have a list of things that you would never hope that your child ever experiences or is subjected to. Whatever that list is, I'm pretty sure that I have experienced all of them, but maybe one. And so I say that not necessarily to have pity or to feel sorry for. I say that because those things have defined who I am today, and they have made me who I am today. The really turning point for that was the fact that I had caring adults in my life that were kind of thrown and hurdled in there out of nowhere at the perfect and right time. In 5th grade, I was a part of an after-school program that intervened at the perfect time. A little backstory, I have an older sister who spent majority of her life incarcerated, as well as other close friends and siblings. And so, as you can imagine, I had a pretty limited scope of what was available to me out in the world. And so having caring adults that stepped in and made sure that I had food every day, as that was something that I struggled with that should be a normal necessity and right of every young person. Also made sure that my education stayed on track. Coming from a family that is battling addiction, certain things like your children's education is not a priority. And so between the age of kindergarten to 2nd grade, I missed between 200 and 250 days of school. So if you can imagine what type of educational impact that has on a young person. So I struggled a lot in my younger years, but luckily with my after-school program, I received tremendous amount of tutoring and support in order for me to get back up to grade level. And then I also received support after I aged out of my school. So went on to high school, and my mentors stayed with me through my life. And so that was something that they didn't have to do. They made sure to check in on me. They knew what high school I was going to, made sure to regularly make sure that I was on track with everything. And they gave me my first employment and my first jobs. They gave me access to scholarships so that I could attend school. I've graduated college. I'm a director at the YMCA, and I work in intervention services now, those same services that I received when I was young. And the impact that has had on my life, it has given me my purpose and my calling. I'm pretty sure that had I not had adults and programs intervene in my life, I would be taking up a space right now in a jail cell, or if not, in other places. I've lost so many of my peers to violence, from gang affiliation as well as from drug overdoses. I just got a call last week that one of my friends has been admitted and almost lost their life that I went to grade school with. And so as you can imagine, I'm working now with these young people who are coming from similar backgrounds and situations. And it's been so impactful and powerful because I'm able to actually relate to my young people and to the community in which we serve, and allow them to know that there are other opportunities, but this wouldn't be possible unless there was funding to allow me to be in those spaces with these young people, to offer them the same interventions that I received, to walk with them through their treatments as they're battling addiction, to assist them in getting out of the life of finding means to support themselves that subject them to a lot of other different harms. And I work with these young people day in and day out. And like I said, for me, I'm one of, I guess you would say, the lucky ones that was able to receive continuous services throughout my life and never wavered from that. And like I said, it's not a sad story. It's a great story because there are people out there that care, and there's funding out there that allowed these adults to come into my life and stay with me. My mentor actually was just my former executive director. He just left, but if that gives you any testament, from 5th grade till B30, to have the same caring adult in your life when you don't have many others is very impactful, no matter how old you are. So that's a little bit of my story.
Thank you. Representative Dean, did you have a question at this point?
Mr. Chair, I will delay my question until after testimony.
Okay. You're a remarkable young woman.
Thank you.
Who's next?
I will let my next testifier introduce himself.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Paul Munier. I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Intervention Programs Association. We are an association of about 240 organizations that work with young people, just like the testimony you heard. Members, I have to tell you, there are so many young people out there that don't have access to services. And they're growing up in these environments, these situations that if you asked yourself, if you were placed in that situation, how resilient would you be? How able would you be to overcome some of the things that we heard? And it's happening a lot. And one of the things we're trying to do is help people become contributing members of society. In public safety, you all have an incredibly difficult job to, it seems like the number one thing of an elected person is public safety. And the demands for services from adults is so high. The cost of public safety, the cost of corrections just keeps going like this. I heard yesterday there was testimony for $44 million more for corrections officers in the prisons. Sounds like that might be necessary, but what I'm asking you to consider and think deeply about what we're trying to do to bend that cost curve down just a little bit. It seems like you have two options. One is you could cut services, or the other is you could try to slow down the demand for adults that likely are going to be consuming adult intervention services the rest of their life through incarceration, drug and alcohol treatment, addiction, family abuse, things like that. And I have to tell you, every once in a while, members, somebody who isn't a big player here at the Capitol, somebody who doesn't have an army of people, might sit in front of you and have a really good idea of how we can improve public safety and how we can use our taxpayer dollars very wisely. And oh, by the way, produce people like this who are contributing members, who are, Stacy, her smile is infectious. She's so sharp, she's so intelligent, and she's only one of about 300,000 youth that are growing up in this kind of environment in the state of Minnesota. Sometimes, members, people have a really good idea. We have a ton of support, a ton of bipartisan support to fund these youth intervention programs. Everybody we talk to gets it. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out if we can help young people by spending very little money through intervention programs, avoid much bigger costs in the long run. The real difficult part we have is moving that support to funding. And somehow we need somebody somewhere to stand up and say, we have to take care of young people like Stacy here, because look at the outcome when we do. Members, I don't believe this is a complicated thing. When we all grew up, most of us had somebody who cared for us unconditionally, and on the other side of the coin, somebody who held us accountable and set high standards for us. If you don't have that as a young person, your chances of finding your niche in your community are pretty low. What we have to do is connect these people, these young people, to adults that can build trusting, caring relationships at the community level. I've said this, I think, to every one of you on this committee. I don't think the state of Minnesota is the answer to this, But I can tell you, communities throughout the state are trying to deal with this, and they don't have enough funding to meet the needs of the kids in their community. And the state of Minnesota is picking up all the back-end costs when those local communities fail. These kids need to get connected at their local level. So I'm asking you to, somebody please be a champion and help young people grow up to be outstanding members of our community, like the testimony you just heard today. Thank you for your time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Testifier, do you have more testifiers, Representative Ells?
Chair, I do not have any more testifiers.
Representative Dean?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's good to see you, Mr. Meunier, and Stacy, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name. Thank you for being here. Your story sort of touches me in my life, and this is ultimately going to lead to my question. When we look at the services that the YIP programs provide, there sort of seems to be that cutoff around 18. And we all know that the adolescent brain doesn't get fully developed till 24. And the issues around executive function happens differently for different people. I'm curious, when you think of that cutoff period, and it sounds like you didn't experience that because by that time you had in place an incredible mentor that helped you through times that may have been difficult because, I mean, let's face it, becoming an adult is really, really hard. And I guess the question is, first off, 100% supportive. I think that, you know, if we're not investing money instead of spending money, that we're not doing it right here. And I think this is clearly one of those investments that have a huge, huge impact on ongoing costs in other areas. But if you could just talk about, you know, the age groups and the focus and, you know, what happens to someone that enters a program at like 17 and a half? You know, what happens to them after that point? Because, you know, as someone who was not exposed to programs like this in my adolescence, I ultimately, you know, landed in the, you know, the court system and the criminal justice system, which I think was probably not the best thing to happen to me, but at the same time, I think it was the best thing that happened to me, if that makes any sense. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, Representative Dean, you're absolutely correct about brain science. The statute itself says to work with young people between 6 of 18. The vast majority of our programs that work with the older kids continue to work with them past that age, because you can't just walk away from somebody because they're 18. If they're growing up in an environment where there's abuse or there's neglect or there's chemical abuse, just arbitrarily turning 19, 20, or 21 isn't going to be sufficient to help them. But we do know that the brain is fully developed and the executive functioning, hopefully, is formed by age 24, 25, and most of our programs don't go beyond that. But most of you are aware of the ACEs study, I'm sure. The medical community will tell you that toxic stress has a long-lasting, if not permanent, effect on brain development. So if you're middle school age and your father is abusing your mother and then you're supposed to go to school and learn algebra, you know, your brain isn't developing the way most people will, and that's going to have a long-lasting impact on you. So, Representative, I hope I answered your question. Most of our programs that work with the older kids work with them beyond 18, even though the statute says 6 to 18.
I think you turned out pretty good.
Mr. Chair, I think there are some people that might debate that.
Perspective. For those of you that have been on the committee for a few years, Representative Cornish brought in a group a couple years ago called Right on Crime, and not exactly what I would call flaming liberals, but they testified that they found a 10-to-1 return on money that was invested in youth programs. And that I thought was an outstanding testament to the work that they do. And again, I think Representative Cornish said he wished they had been around when he was younger too. Representative Johnson.
Chair Cornish, thank you.
Chair Cornish no longer here.
It's going to be a long day today. Well, thank you anyway. I'm going to be speaking in support of this program. It's a great program. It was 43 years ago in 1976, the legislature established this program as a 501c3. I don't know if the legislature planned on the state funding it for 43 years because they set it up as a 501c3, but it's a program that is well intended, does fabulous, fabulous work. But I think also this program was designed to work with the communities. And we need to work harder on getting the communities to get more involved because it is for them that we do this program. In my community, we didn't have YIPA. We didn't have those programs when I was growing up. It was our churches and our communities and our civics groups that did things for the youth and worked with the youth, created programs for them. And it is fabulous for the kids, give them something to strive and be better. So the work you do is fabulous, it's worthwhile, but like I say, I hope that the communities are listening to this so that they do get involved, because it's important for the communities and the parents of these kids to be involved. That's going to make our communities better. Now, we want to try to keep kids out of the system, get them the help before they get into the system. And I think you know where I'm going with the personnel policies that law enforcement have. I hope they're listening. We've got to the point, because of lawsuits and everything else, that policies are so strict that law enforcement officers lose their job for not following the policy. Not that they broke the law, but they broke the policy. And our policy has gotten so strict, if they get to the point where they deal with something, what the policies dictate what they have to do. Because they talked to the kid who did something wrong, instead of dealing with it right then and there, giving them some type of diversion right on the street, working with their parents, they go into the system. And once into the system, it's a good chance they're doomed for failure. And where if we could have something, a minor incident can destroy a kid's life. Where if we have programs like this, if law enforcement could get the kids hooked up to these programs before they get into the system, they may never be in the system.
Representative Johnson, we actually have another bill, and we have 5 more people.
Yep, I'm just finishing
And we
up.
have some kids that want to testify
So
too.
I'm hoping the law enforcement community is also listening to take a look at their policies to allow law enforcement officers to do the job they need to do, keeping the public safe, but also protecting these kids.
Mr. Chair, can I just interject one thing? The
Sure.
Minnesota Sheriff's Association, the Minnesota County Attorneys Association, the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association, and the Minnesota Juvenile Officers Association formally passed resolutions as youth intervention as a way to improve public safety in local communities.
Thank you. Okay, Representative Howard. And again, just remind everybody, we have another bill, and we have some youth that wish to testify. So if we could keep things short and succinct, that would be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief. I just want to thank Representative Edelson and the testifiers for carrying this really important bill. And, we talk a lot about in this committee about, how are we going to use dollars efficiently and the impact we're going to have. And the impact of the resources here are, as we've heard from Ms. Collier, they're life-changing. And that kind of life-changing impact is happening in all of our communities across the state. I had the opportunity with Representative Edelson to talk about some of that with Cornerstone, an organization in my community, but is doing amazing work throughout our entire region and state, in our schools, counseling youth that have been dealing with trauma. And just to underscore the individual impact that these dollars are having on youth are so important. And at least just one question, and you've hit on this a little bit, but this is one of those programs where all of us around here are going to say, yes, we support this, but at the end of the day, it becomes how much resources we're going to put behind this. And so if either the bill author or any folks could testify, what are we talking here about, $1 million of this program? How many students will be served? How many youth will be served by the resources we could be putting towards this initiative?
Mr. Union?
Mr. Chair, Representative, thank you. As I mentioned, you're really just supporting community-based programs. So the average cost per kid that the state pays is $200. The vast majority of the money is being picked up at the local level. So roughly for every $1 million advocated, you're positively impacting 5,000 youth. I mean, that's how the numbers work out. I don't know how else to explain it. This is how much is allocated. These are many kids are being touched. It's amazing because you're really just supporting the local level. I'm not asking the state, or nobody's asking the state to be these programs. We're just saying, help the local community so you don't have to pick up all the costs in the back end. So about 5,000 per million.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Follow-up? No. Representative Grossel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, testifiers and representative, for bringing this forward. Just a brief, when I was a deputy sheriff, I knew the families in the area, and I knew the kids that were on the edge. And I'd go and find them. I'd go and find them on those Friday nights, Saturday nights, when they're gathered up, and just sit and visit with them. Just sit and visit with them and listen, and try to give them some sound counsel and guidance, and also every little bit that we can do to keep them out of the back seat of my squad car, keep them out in the community. That's outstanding.
That's right.
So anything we can do to make sure that this keeps moving forward, that's a good thing.
Thank you, Representative Grossel. Reasonably short. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They had referenced the ACEs study, and it was fun. I went to a training about a year ago about the ACEs score and several studies that have been done. And what was most interesting to me about that particular training was that when you have children with high ACEs score and you track them through life, you find that there's sort of a divergent trajectory. So you've got those that are first responders, EMT, police, fire. So these, high stress, emergency responder type people. And then you have the criminality. So there's this divergence of, the helpers and then those that didn't get help. And so it's interesting to see, as you had referenced that the difference is intervention. The difference is there is, a mentor, an adult that actually helps bring healing to that life. And so they want to help others as opposed to kind of tear others down or be more self-centered or things like that. So it's great what you're doing. And even you mentioned the ACEs study. I'm like, oh, that's just so timely because that is something that is sort of emerging. And I know Representative Edelson could probably speak to that for hours, I'm sure, but just to briefly talk about that. So thank you for referencing that and realizing that completely changes that trajectory of someone's life.
Thank you.
Representative Poston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Edelson, I'd just like to echo what several representatives have said. Thank you for bringing this bill. I think this is a great program. I think they do an awesome job. And I think this is money very well spent today, and it will save us money in the future. So thank you.
Okay. Is there anybody that wishes to provide public testimony? Not seeing anyone. Representative Edelson, would you like to have the last word and renew your motion?
Sure. I want to thank you, members. It's really, it's nice when we can come together on legislation that helps kids. I don't think the public knows how bipartisan we can actually be. So every child needs somebody that believes in them, and I know that our committee knows that. So I would like to renew my motion to have this bill laid over for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. With that, I will relinquish the chair to our normal chair. Well, reasonably normal. Yeah, I'm sorry, wrong choice of words.
Can you step out after? Yeah, I just want testimony. Can you step out? I'll wait. Okay, good.
Good afternoon, members. I wasn't sure I was going to get the gavel back from Chair Constant. I was trying to figure out what would I do then. I had a bill up in another committee that's going to happen more and more for all of us, I suspect. So hopefully we can work with each other to accommodate that. We do have, as Chair Constant shared, we do have another bill, and then we also have the Minnesota Youth Council is going to provide some testimony. And then I've been informed that Representative Johnson has a question for me, and so I want to make sure that I entertain that before we recess. But if it's okay with you, Representative Johnson, I'd like to move this first, and then I'll be sure to spare some time at the end. So with that, Representative Edelson, you have House File 1604.
1036, I believe.
Oh.
Is it 1604? Oh, good grief. Oh, 1604, yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm catching up here. All right. And so your motion is to lay this over for possible inclusion in our omnibus bill. So your bill is before us.
Thank you, Chair. Chair and members, the Children's Law Center has been serving children in foster care since 1995. Working with a small staff, the Children's Law Center leverages the resources of Minnesota's legal community by training and supporting private sector attorneys to represent children pro bono. The Children's Law Center has trained over 860 volunteer attorneys and represented over 2,800 foster children who are thrust into the court over the abuse and neglect of their parents, not of any wrongdoing of their own. In the past 6 years, the caseload has nearly doubled due to changes made seeking to protect more kids. This has put extreme strain on the child protection system, and we are seeing requests from all sides responding to the influx of cases. 2 years ago, this legislature unanimously passed McKenna's Law that ensured every child had access to their right of counsel. And while we are rightly seeing more kids represented in these cases, no increase in funding has been accompanied. This bill requests an appropriation of $400,000 in the fiscal year of 2020 and $400,000 in the fiscal year of 2021. These funds will allow the Children's Law Center to hire more staff and to do more outreach and training to bring in more volunteer attorneys, all with the goal of helping more kids. As a former guardian ad litem, I know firsthand the horror stories that rarely make their way to the state capitol hearing rooms. Representative Grossell, I like the stories that we heard with your bill yesterday. While guardians represent the best interest of the child, state law requires that children over 10 be appointed legal counsel to represent their expressed wishes. Sometimes their desire conflicts with the recommendations of the guardian, and children deserve to have their conflict heard. Too many children live in abuse or neglectful homes, and too often the strain on the system means the views of the children are not heard by judges, making life-altering decisions to either reunite a family or to deem it beyond repair. Beyond parental rights, Children's Law Center volunteer attorneys advocate for the children's right to stay with their siblings, to have stability in what school they attend, and to agree or not to an eventual adoption. This legislature has a responsibility to all kids, to give them the absolute best chances to have success in their lives, no matter the circumstances of their upbringing. Members, we have a video which we're going to show you now, and I just want to just preface with saying that it's a hard video to watch, but it's a good one.
My name is Sophie, and I am 19. I entered foster care because I grew up in a house of rape. My dad raped me since I was 3. He raped my sister. When I turned 14, or 13 actually, he got me pregnant. And a few days before I was due, mind you, I've never had any prenatal care, no doctor's visits. When it was a few days before I was due, he kidnapped me. And I ended up spending the whole night walking around Minnehaha Falls. And the next day, the police found us at the Mall of America and then arrested my dad, brought me back to my mom. My mom didn't want anything to do with me. She was actually jealous because I got pregnant by my dad, and she had always wanted another baby girl, and I just happened to be pregnant with a baby girl. February 19th, 2007. My beautiful baby girl was born. I found an adoptive home for her. She's in an open adoption. She is 5 now. I usually see her every year, taking a couple of years off because it's a little too hard, but her family's perfect, and it's the reason why I moved to foster care, just to get away from my family. My first placement was more of a halfway home. Even though it was long-term, I was there for 4 years. It was not very much of a family setting. I got the healing I needed. I got the first-time parents I needed. And then after 4 years, I was ready to move on. When I was 18, I moved into I call it my adoptive home now. So that's my second placement, and it's the parents I've always wanted, the family I've always wanted. When I was 16 or 17, I believe that's when I got my Children's Law Center lawyer.
I do remember my first meeting with Sophie. She was probably as tough on me as any hiring client has ever been. You could tell she was skeptical. She was going to ask some tough questions. She was going to make me earn her trust.
Oh boy, when I first got a lawyer, I didn't think they'd support me. I didn't think anybody would stand, behind me and, advocate for me. But when I met her, she was just, right away I knew she was just perfect. She just fit perfectly with me, and we just, like BFFs when we get together.
The real reason that Sophie was looking for an attorney is because the county was refusing to take any action to terminate her mother's parental rights. Her father's rights had been terminated, but for whatever reason, the county was taking the position that it was not going to move to terminate her mother's rights, even though her mother really, I think, either knew or let the abuse against Sophie and her sister at the hands of her father occurred.
Well, my case was going on in the courtroom, and if there was something I wanted, she would go all out for. She would fight tooth and nail for me, and she would just absolutely advocate for me. Oh, it made me feel amazing. I was like, finally, someone's got my back.
So we really, we spent a number of times in a small little room in that courthouse crying and trying to figure out how to get the results that we wanted. And finally, we were able to, I remember having a conversation with her mother just one-on-one saying, essentially kind of begging to say, can you please do one good thing for your children? And she finally agreed to terminate voluntarily.
I'm going to be going to Argosy University in September. For my career, I originally wanted veterinarian, but that kind of seemed a little hard, so I'm going for vet tech and law enforcement.
She is tough as nails and yet has a heart of gold. You'd think that after everything she's been through that, I think I would just shut down and be in the fetal position for the rest of my life. I honestly don't know how she's survived what she's survived, but not just survived, thrived, and has this beautiful, compassionate outlook about life and a true kindness towards other people. The empathy and compassion that she feels for other people is unique. And having that in light of everything she's been through is just inspiring and amazing.
Oh, if I didn't have Anne, I would still be tied to my parents, and I would be a total wreck. I wouldn't have the freedom I feel now.
Anytime you represent someone like Sophie, it's life-changing. There's no problem that comes my way, whether it be a personal issue or work issue or whatever it might be, that Sophie comes to mind as someone who has faced more adversity than any of us could possibly bear to think about, and has come out of it, like I said, with just this amazing outlook. And so she's inspired me, I try to emulate her. Probably will never achieve the kind of outlook she has, but I will certainly keep shooting for it, and that's changed my life.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Please proceed.
Chair, thank you. Sophie's story is a heartbreaking one, but it outlines the importance of the Children's Law Center work. I would like to now introduce you to my first testifier, and actually she's my only testifier, Lilia Panteleva. Thank you. She's the Executive Director of Children's Law Center.
Welcome to the committee, Ms. Panteleva.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. CLC is a private nonprofit organization that was established to provide legal representation to children who are in foster care. And we utilize pro bono volunteer attorneys such as Ann Lochner, who you saw, who is a partner at Robinson Kaplan, high caliber litigation attorney who is doing this on a pro bono basis for our clients. Being a child's attorney in child protection matters means we serve as their voice in the courtroom, informing the court of the child's expressed wishes when children want to go home or have visitations with their siblings or live with a particular relative who can provide that safety and stability that they all need. We also advocate for their legal rights because children in foster care do have legal rights established by statutes to remain in the same school, to have visitations with their parents, to be placed in a less restrictive setting, to attend court hearings, or to stay in touch with their siblings even after they are adopted. We also counsel our clients and explain what is happening on their case because court can be intimidating to adults, let alone children, let alone traumatized children who have gone through tremendous trauma and abuse, and we just never give up on them. We ensure that they have a voice and a seat at the table when permanent decisions are made about their lives. We're part of Safety Net for Children, and our impact often lasts beyond the length of a case. In fact, in the previous bill, we talked about how long children are in touch with a stable adult. We represent our children through the age of 18 or 21 if they age out of the system, but very often our volunteer attorneys continue to stay in touch with our clients because of that relationship that they have established, and oftentimes they are the only stable adult in their lives. One of the very amazing measurable outcomes that we have is that nationally the report is that only 65% of children in foster care will graduate from high school. Children we represent graduate at a rate of 75% or higher. Our auditors estimate that if our volunteers were to charge for their services at an average billable rate, the cost of the service we provide together with our volunteer attorneys would be $3.1 million on an annual basis. It's an amazing cost saving to the state. However, as you could probably imagine and already know, volunteering is never free, and it takes an organization to oversee all of this work. It will not come as a surprise to you to hear that the number of children in foster care has increased dramatically in the last few years. For us, for CLC alone, that number has increased by 150% since 2010. We are running out of resources to meet the current need for our services. Our staff are handling more cases than ever before. In fact, our caseload for staff attorneys has increased by 464% since 2010. We are in a desperate need of help to increase our capacity and strengthen our infrastructure so we can continue to utilize pro bono work through volunteer attorneys. A couple of years ago, in 2016, we came to the legislature for an ask. I believe we asked for about $450,000. We received a third. We received a grant for $150,000, which we are incredibly grateful for. However, the caseload continued to increase, even though we received just a fraction of that money. And I am here today asking for an additional $400,000 so we don't turn down the children that are in need of our services. Some of you may remember McKenna Erin Holz. She was here last couple of years passing McKenna's Law, which was an incredible thing to do, and I'm so proud of our legislature for passing it. Without an attorney, the county was sending her and her siblings back to her abusive father many times. She was in and out of foster care 11 times. And it wasn't until she received an attorney that she found a stable adult with her grandfather's family, which was a great outcome. And for children like McKenna, this service cannot be more important. If the state has an obligation to remove a child from an unsafe home and therefore separating them from their parents, siblings, school, relatives, friends, church, and turning their whole world upside down, the state then also has an obligation to ensure that these children are heard, that their needs are met, that their rights are honored. These kids are in the system through no fault of their own and have a great potential to succeed as their future generation. Now imagine you're 12 and you are suddenly removed from home and thrown into a complicated legal arena. which will decide your future permanently. Wouldn't you want a lawyer by your side? So we need help. At $3.1 million pro bono work that our volunteer attorneys provide, $400,000 is just a fraction of what this would cost if the state were to pay for the services we provide. I thank you in advance for this consideration, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Montaleva. Representative Edelson, we have about a little over 20 minutes left in this hearing. We still do want to hear from the Minnesota Youth Council, and I also do want to at least quickly address Representative Johnson's question. And so I guess I'm just sort of sending clues here about that we need to move along. And I don't know if you have other testifiers, but I'm wondering if perhaps we might not switch to questions for Ms. Montaleva while she's here.
Chair, we have no other testifiers, so we can take member questions then.
Yeah, very good. Are there any questions, observations from members? All right. Well, thank you then, Ms. Montaleva. Thank you for the work that you do at the Children's Law Center. And we will be seriously considering your request. Thank you, Representative Edelson, for bringing us House File 1604. And with that, the chair lays House File 1604 over for possible inclusion in our omnibus bill. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair.
And then we do have the Minnesota Youth Council folks up here. So I'm going to ask you all to come on up together, if you will. Let me just say while they do that, members, perhaps some of my colleagues here have had both the privilege and the reality of appearing before the Minnesota Youth Council. I've done it 3 times over the years. I was part of Representative Marquardt's bill many years ago, creating the council. And I will admit to these fine young people that the first time I went before the council, I thought, like how difficult can this be? Young folks, who are kind of like starstruck, by the system and the whole bit. Boy, did I get a lesson. The council put me through the ringer with incredibly astute professional interactions and questions of me. And so the next 2 times that I presented to the council, I probably was better prepared presenting to the Youth Council than I have been in presenting bills here to my colleagues. So I've always found the rigor, the seriousness, the thoughtfulness of the council to be a real credit to the young people who participate in it, to the organizers of it, and quite frankly to the vision of our state to have put together this terrific, powerful opportunity for public policy to be shaped and influenced by Minnesota's young people. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. We'll probably do about 15 minutes or so. Hopefully that'll work. But whatever order you want to go, and you know the drill, you introduce yourself and then proceed with the testimony. Welcome to the committee.
Well, all right. Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. My name is Hannah Erickson. I'm a sophomore at Green Mile High School, and I'm a third-year Minnesota Youth Council member representing Congressional District 8 on the Policy Committee. If you are not familiar with the MYC, we are a legislatively mandated network of 36 youth members from all across Minnesota that exist to provide some much-needed youth perspective regarding various issues throughout the state. The council is divided into 2 committees that work as advisors for both the Minnesota
Hannah, can I just interrupt you very quickly? And maybe the pages might be able to help with this too. I noticed this earlier, but the sound isn't quite what we want it to be, but perhaps if you can also lean forward into your mic a bit, that might help as well. Please, my apology for the interruption. Please continue.
The council is divided into 2 committees that work as advisors for both the Minnesota Department of Education and the Minnesota Legislature. The issues that the Minnesota Youth Council chooses to focus on throughout each term are invariably ones that directly affect youth across the state. The MYC wants to ensure that no decision is made about youth without youth. And we go about this through a multitude of ways, and one of which is through our policy platform. And this agenda was set using information from surveys done by MYC members and the Minnesota Student Survey, along with direct communication with youth across the state. Currently, our policy platform expresses support for bills relating to opioid education, consent education, increasing teachers of color and American Indian teachers in Minnesota, funding for after-school programming, mental health support in schools, and measures for increased school safety. With the overarching theme of the NYC's legislative agenda being safety, it is crucial to emphasize that safety is much more than preventing physical violence. I will be speaking about the issues that the NYC has identified that fall outside of the realm of that physical violence. One area of the focus that NYC has taken on is promoting evidence-based substance misuse curriculums in grades 5 through 12. We, as a council, have worked directly with the For Jake's Sake Foundation to support legislation in regards to these curriculums. The substance abuse epidemic is very apparent, especially within, our communities of young people. The council's goal in working with the For Jake's Sake Foundation is simple: progressing towards comprehensive and effective education regarding the dangers of substance misuse. A second focus of the council is supporting legislation that would create a new state funding stream and allocate $25 million per year to provide over 25,000 youth with the opportunity to participate in after-school programs. This allocation of money would go towards funding competitive grants for these after-school programs. The council believes that after-school programming is absolutely necessary for a positive and safe learning environment, and recognizes that this legislation is instrumental in providing students with resources and opportunities that they would not otherwise have access to. Another goal of the NYC is to promote age-appropriate conversations about consent and sex education, and the members of the council released a statement in 2018 expressing this. Comprehensive sex education and conversations regarding consent are steps that we, as a council, recognize as necessary for an environment that is safe for everyone. In addition to all of these goals that the council holds, the NYC has seen a great demand for increased mental health supports in schools. NYC members and their constituents have expressed a desire for increased counselor-to-student ratio and other resources being made more readily available to students across Minnesota. The NYC believes that if these goals are accomplished, it will lead to a safer Minnesota for all students. Now I will pass this on to my fellow youth council member, Anushka, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Welcome to the committee.
Hi. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and representatives serving on the House Public Safety Committee. My name is Anushka Thorat, and I'm a junior at Edina High School. I currently serve as an at-large representative for the Minnesota Youth Council, and I'm a member of the NYC's Policy Committee. It is crucial for the youth voice to be amplified and included in the political process, which is why I sincerely want to thank you for hearing from the Youth Council. Today, as a representative of the Council, I want to recognize our unique platform to promote change, which supplies us with the means to address legislators directly and call on our policymakers to further increase safety in our schools. The Minnesota Youth Council wrote a statement on our school safety last year after the Parkland massacre. As the mandated voice of the youth from Minnesota, as such, it has very unique and partisan voices. However, regardless of party lines, we are in agreement that student safety and advocacy have always been and will remain nonpartisan and massively important issues. It is for this reason that the NYC, through me, would officially voice its support for students rallying together and demand that senseless acts of gun violence should never be a source of fear in public settings, and most notably in schools. These acts of gun violence directly threaten our ability to feel safe, not just in a learning environment, but in every single space that we occupy. Our safety is under siege, and it is crucial for our representatives to recognize and tackle this issue with the gravity it demands. It's important to clarify that our call for safety is not an attack on the Second Amendment, since many members of the NYC are supporters of the Second Amendment, but is rather a sincere request to our government to fulfill its fundamental duties in keeping its posterity safe. However, any legislation concerning school safety should be viewed through the lens of safety and not just gun control to facilitate a bipartisan conversation. We recognize that many factors contribute to gun violence, ranging from mental health issues to flaws in our investigative system, and hope that the nuances in our society that fester senseless violence not be left out of this discussion either. We have stood by on the sidelines for far too long, watching preventable shootings occur, hoping that our elected officials will take some course of action to protect our schools, concerts, festivals, and places of worship. This is unacceptable. It is time our government stops separating politics from people. When we don't stand for basic human rights, we lose the right to call ourselves human. Every single student has the human right to feel safe. This is not a political question, but simply a human one. We demand that those elected to keep us safe match their concern with their commitment, truly represent us, and through the power to establish laws, finally act. However, the Minnesota Youth Council recognizes that preventing violence means more than gun violence prevention. We also know that investing in prevention not only serves a tremendous amount of money, but also provides learning opportunities for students all over the state. Over the past months, members of the Minnesota Youth Council have worked together to survey over 1,000 students across the state to ask about the issues that they want the council to advocate for. We have also worked with the Minnesota Department of Education and used the Minnesota Student Survey, which surveys over 160,000 students from districts across the state. Some of the biggest priorities for students include support for mental health and funding for after-school activities as well. Therefore, as the voice of youth in Minnesota, we urge legislators to not only support bills that lead to gun violence prevention, but also bills that support young people by providing a safe time to spend after school, and support for young people to speak with licensed professionals regarding mental health issues. Investing in students is investing in the safety for our state. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Panat. And of course, later on today, we'll be having discussions on some of those issues that you raised, and hopefully you'll be able to observe the discussion among us in our conversation with the public as well. My understanding is that you are a constituent of one of our members here.
I'm sorry?
That you're a constituent of one of our members here.
Yes.
So Representative Edelson, it's wonderful to have young people from your district join us here today. And then, last but not least, please proceed.
Greetings, Chair and Committee, and thank you for your interest in the MYC's work. My name is Arjun Maheshwari, and I'm a sophomore at Edina High School, also in Representative Edelson's district.
And I'm sorry, sir, can I just interrupt? Can you spell your last name for us, please?
Yes, Maheshwari.
Very good. Please proceed.
I represent Congressional District 3 in the MYC, and I sit on the Policy Committee. In the last year, especially in the aftermath of that Parkland shooting, the MYC has taken a greater role in establishing expectations for legislation regarding gun violence prevention. Before I get into possible policy solutions, the lens from which we view the issue is critical for a bipartisan future. We see gun violence prevention measures as the following. First and foremost, we stress the importance of viewing the issue as one of public safety and not as one of government intrusion and unnecessary regulation. The gun violence prevention movement has attracted a bad rep for seeming to try to infringe upon citizens' rights. It doesn't have to be that way. The MYC believes that the discussion must emphasize the safety of our citizens and reference how what the country needs at its heart is a crackdown on violence. Especially in a state like Minnesota, with a rich history of guns being used for recreation and not for violence, the MYC stresses the importance of battling gun violence as opposed to regulating access to guns. This is the only way to achieve a bipartisan future. The second lens from which we view the issue is that we strongly urge legislators to curate legislation that does not affect the average citizen. Rather, legislation should only target the most vulnerable section of the population, and it should regulate corrupt sellers of guns. Measures that seek to infringe upon an ordinary citizen's ability to purchase a gun, namely any sort of ban on guns, are generally politically infeasible and have proven to be futile in the past. Reference the assault rifle ban that was failed to be renewed by Congress. Every time a ban is passed, the gun lobby is able to rally its members to oppose it because it limits the rights of law-abiding citizens. However, by narrowing the scope of the legislation, such fierce opposition is less likely, and thus the legislation would actually have a chance of passing. With that in mind, elaborating on our past statements about gun violence, the MYC sees a three-pronged approach to alleviate the gun violence problem. Various members of the MYC, including myself, have discussed policy options with various legislators from both parties, and based on those discussions, we've come to understand the possible solutions that will most likely attract support from both party leaderships. First, the state should invest in programs aimed at identifying and counseling those on the verge of harming others. These initiatives target the small population of people who account for the vast majority of murders. Programs like these are universally acclaimed because they focus on violence prevention rather than the restriction of guns. It may seem like the state would just be throwing money at a cause with little potential benefit, but programs like these have seen success nationwide. Cities like Boston, Oakland, Stockton, and Indianapolis saw drastic drops in their gun violence after they implemented initiatives to counsel those at risk. Indeed, the Department of Justice has characterized such programs as one of the few ways to effectively curb gun violence, both in urban areas and in terms of mass shootings. And they save money too. Such programs would probably be similar in their funding organization to the YIP described earlier at this meeting. The state would fund it and establish the guidelines. However, individual communities would be the ones who would actually be implementing the programs themselves. The second policy initiative that the MIC supports is legislation that targets sellers. Almost half of all black market guns are in circulation because of corrupt sellers. By advocating for laws that require licensing, inspections, employee background checks, and videotaping of gun purchases, we can help address the root of the problem. The greater idea of this type of legislation is to emphasize the notion that we need to look beyond just regulating citizens in order to actually diminish opposition to gun violence prevention measures. We need to find ways that protect the rights of law-abiding citizens. By monitoring gun sellers, gun owners are unaffected, yet criminals will not be able to get guns as easily. Finally, the MYC supports legislation that limits the amount of exceptions to the law. In past years, numerous gun laws have emerged around the country that seek to limit private purchasers, but they all contain one fatal flaw: long clauses that list numerous exceptions to the law. The MYC voted in favor of Senator Little's background check bill last year, but our sentiment remained that the large number of exceptions listed in the bill would likely deem the bill ineffectual. Whenever there is room for interpretation, people are able to take advantage of it, and the law becomes so nuanced that it is impossible to enforce. Not only do exceptions allow for numerous loopholes, including the use of straw purchasers to buy arms, but they open the door to potentially discriminatory enforcement. If laws are too vague in their guidelines, certain communities may be inadvertently regulated more than others, thereby unfairly targeting specific cohorts of our population more than others. While the MYC still supports gun legislation that pushes the needle forward as much as possible, we view succinct, clear legislation with little room for criminals to get by as the most effectual and the most fair solution to the problem. Thank you for your time, and we urge you to attend our legislative hearing this afternoon, which actually is going to happen in about a few minutes, to hear HF 9, which is going to be heard at this committee later on tonight. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you, Mr. Maheshwari.
Yeah, Maheshwari. Yeah.
Maheshwari. I do want to reserve the last 5 minutes here for a conversation quickly from Representative Johnson. I do want to commend all of you, Ms. Thurrott and Ms. Erickson, for the obvious continued careful deliberation that the Youth Council is about. You do your research, you struggle with issues, and that's what we were hoping you would do. And we appreciate hearing your voices here today. So thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Johnson.
Chair Mariani, just a couple minor issues. One, both dealing with the same subject. First of all, it's been a few days since we've seen any minutes or approved any minutes. I was hoping that they would be here. The longer we wait in doing them, the less likely to remember what we did with so much going on. So I'm asking that we can take care of that and get the minutes done properly at every meeting. And the other issue on the minutes is I've noticed when they've come around that they're already signed before they've been approved. I would ask that they're not signed until after they approve, because the copies that we have here have been signed and they have not been approved yet.
Representative Johnson, I'll look into that. Very good advice, and we will certainly work very diligently to be much more punctual with the minutes. Absolutely. Is there anything else? Well, members, we're going to recess and we're going to reconvene in this same room this evening to take up, bless you, to take up 2 significant bills. I hope that we spend the time between now and then to fortify ourselves a bit. I'm going to grab a few waters myself because I think it's a very important issue we're going to be talking about later in regards to gun safety proposals. And I expect that we're going to have a very rigorous, lively listening session, debate, and decision-making. And I want to make sure that we do that in a way that we bring our best selves to it, that we're as inclusive as possible. You have my commitment in that regard. I have asked our minority party lead over the weekend when I pulled him away from from an event that he was at. Well, I was at an event with my family on Saturday night. If he would be so kind as to join me when we reconvene to send a message, not on the issues before us, because I suspect we don't agree on the bills, but rather in terms of how we would proceed and how we role model as a committee for the broader community and what our expectations are in terms of being as inclusive as we can, given the time limitations, and also as respectful as we can in truly listening to the testimony that's going to be offered then. So my hope is, Representative Johnson, that we can still do that together when we come back. So with that, members, we're going to stand in recess until 7 p.m., and then we'll be back in this room.
Thank you.